So hi there, welcome. My name is Casper and I hope you've just watched my lecture on cognitive load theory for the course on instructional design and evaluation. And I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something from it. And in retrospect, I'd like to talk a bit more about it. So when I presented this lecture, and I think it was about 3 years ago, I was pretty pleased with the lecture. I knew something about the topic and I had prepared it quite well, I believe. And afterwards I thought, well, I liked what I did and I thought it was well liked by the students as well. So I had a lot of criticism on cognitive load theory, but I thought it was a rounded discussion and some opening for further discussion, I guess. And then I went to this conference called Research Ed or Research ED or something, where they connect research with education, a conference visited by many teachers in the Netherlands, and I presented a version of this lecture to teachers and other people who work in the field of education. And it was a 40-minute presentation, so I made it a bit shorter, and again I was pretty pleased with myself for presenting something about cognitive load theory, which is pretty popular in education as an educational theory, and gave some criticism on it. And afterwards this guy came to me and he said, "What the fuck were you doing there? Who the hell are you trying to diss this great guy in the field of educational science and educational psychology called John Sweller?" Now, I've met John Sweller. He's a great guy. His theory is great, and who the hell are you to talk like that about him? And I was like, what the hell? What's happening here? And I said, well, I wasn't really criticizing the guy. I mean, I've never met John Sweller. I was criticizing his theory, and I was giving arguments why I believe that there are a few challenges or problems with cognitive load theory. He said, you're an asshole, basically. He really wanted to kick my ass. And he was not alone there, I think, in reacting like that. People were quite shocked in a sense. And I realized then that I had made a mistake. I had attacked the theory, and I think on right grounds, but I hadn't really talked about the implications of my criticism. And in the lecture you will find this as well. There are a lot of things, I guess, wrong with the theory, but what are the implications for, let's say, a teacher? Does it matter even if the theory is completely correct or if the foundations of the theory are correct? Well, maybe it doesn't, or not that much. It's a theoretical discussion, indeed, and there are problems. But for a teacher, what does it mean? Well, basically not all that much, I think. So that's one mistake I had made, because on this, for students, well, you're learning about educational science and about criticism of educational science. I think that's fine. We're just discussing it on an academic level. But if I'm talking to teachers and people who actually are involved in education, then they're not so much interested in the theory, but more in, how can I help students learn more efficiently, for example. So something like the signaling effect that we talked about in the lecture, well, that's useful. I mean, you can use signals, and every teacher knows this, I guess, but still, the theory gives some theoretical background on this, and it's all fine. Still, there's a lot of other stuff in the theory that's maybe less well funded, but some effects are useful in education, and I hadn't focused on that. Now, another mistake that I made, and that's also in the lecture, I believe, is that I made it too personal. So afterwards, I love making jokes or referring to popular media, popular culture, and I had used the image of Thanos. I mean, he's the main villain of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in a sense, and this movie had just come out. And I was making fun of John Sweller by comparing him to Thanos. I mean, he killed half the universe. I don't think that's a spoiler anymore. Okay? He kills half the universe. John Sweller hasn't killed half the universe. I don't think he's killed anyone. And I made it too personal by talking about Sweller himself, although I believe it is relevant to the case a little bit, but my criticism was focusing on the theory and not on the personal figure of John Sweller or any of his colleagues. So, again, as an academic discussion, I mean, this makes sense. Talk about who are the people involved in the field of cognitive load theory. Sweller, Van Merrienboer, Fred Paas, and there are some many other people as well involved. And that's interesting. How are these people communicating? How are they interacting with each other? So that's one other mistake that I made. Now I still maintain that there are problems with the theory. So the points that I make at the end of the lecture, where I give this long list of challenges or problems with the theory, it still holds up pretty well. So evolution has become even more of a foundation under the theory. So if you read articles on cognitive load theory, also by John Sweller himself, he's still writing about this stuff. He now basically has turned the tables on this argument, and evolution has even become more of a foundation under the theory for some reason. I don't think it's required really. Another weak point is element interactivity. So what determines intrinsic load? Well, it's element interactivity, but again, this interacts with prior knowledge and other personal characteristics of a learner, and the theory doesn't really have an answer to that, apart from adding even more variables into the equation like motivation or other personality factors. I don't think that makes the theory any stronger. The biggest weakness, I think, of the theory at this time is measuring cognitive load. There has been almost no progress in that field for the past 30 years. So they're still maintaining that the PASS scale of measuring cognitive load by this one measure, one item questionnaire is in a sense still the best way to measure cognitive load. Well, anybody who knows something about measuring a psychometric property knows that this doesn't really make all that much sense. So the main progress that has been made in the past few years is using ever more intricate measures and techniques to basically show that this measure still works. So I've read an article from 2021 where they used confirmatory factor analysis, for example. You know, if you follow the course in assessment and evaluation, you know what I mean with that, to show, well, that basically cognitive load can be measured through a short questionnaire, and then you get the three types of cognitive load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load, and there are different types of load. So in my lecture, and John Sweller himself, we say, well, basically they got rid of germane load in around 2010, and yet it's still pretty popular in some circles, also measuring it. That's a bit weird. So yeah, another type of technique that I've seen is item response theory, which basically led to the same conclusion. And so there are lots of different articles and meta-analyses showing that you can still measure cognitive load, but it's a circular argument in a sense. They show that they can measure it, and what it reveals that it's possible to measure it using that technique. So one thing we've been working on, and we're still working on, this article that I've been talking about in that same, from the time of that same lecture, still not finished. There was a corona crisis that came over it in a sense, but we'll finish it. Our conclusion is in a sense that this field is quite static and not really making that much progress. Also, that the theory has trouble getting rid of stuff that they tried to get rid of quite a few years ago, like germane load that I mentioned, but also the mental efficiency measure that crops up every now and again in the literature, and has seen no improvement over the past, let's say, 20 years. So my earlier conclusions in the lecture were study the sources, the real sources, which I still believe is the best way to get really into a theory, to get behind the ideas of a theory. And this goes for cognitive load theory, but for example also, let's say, the Daisy and Ryan studies that led to the self-determination theory of motivation. I would say if you really want to know something about that theory, study the sources. Study Daisy and Ryan, for example. How did they come up with their theory? People do make mistakes indeed. I still see people making mistakes or giving another vision of the history behind the theory that is somewhat modified from the original history. Weird things are still going on. So study everything, the arguments, the changes, who publishes with whom, where do they publish, who do they cite, who do they not cite, but don't get too personal, because you may really insult people when you talk about people instead of their arguments. And finally, indeed, don't expect to find answers to all your questions. I've been studying this field for quite a few years now, and I'm still collecting new articles and new material and thinking about it. Do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. I don't claim to. But I do hope to improve myself in the future and give better presentations to teachers when I talk about cognitive load theory. So that's my look back on this lecture and on the theory, and we will continue with discussing it. Thank you.